So we've done a bit of work with these two species. So here's the Bell's vireo. It's a short nesting bird. The dick sissels we talked about. So, you know, dick sissel nest with the blue eggs. So one of the striking things about Konza Prairie, and one of the things that really characterizes this bird community, we have really high rates of parasitism. Dick sissels, you know, depending on the year and site, but somewhere from 80 to 95% of those nests will receive at least one cowbird egg. And this is often what you see. Like, not only that they're getting one cowbird egg, but they're getting parasitized by multiple cowbird eggs. I think our record the last 2 years is we had one nest that had 7 cowbird eggs in it. So what can they do? Well, in the case of vireos, they can desert or accept. If they do accept, they're going to, well, they might produce cowbirds, but they won't produce any vireo chicks. In the case of the dick sissels, it's a bit puzzling, but, you know, to my eye, I mean, I can see the cowbird eggs here. So they don't abandon. So the question is, you know, can they not see that difference? Have they not evolved a response? Or are they going to accept those because, well, as you can tell, these eggs are about the same size as the cowbirds, and they can actually fledge dick sissel chicks out of this nest because they accept those other eggs. So we tested this experimentally. For a couple of years, we did a cowbird removal experiment. So we had these cowbird traps out. We're going to use these again the next couple of years around the calumets, not for moving cowbirds, but actually for catching and color banding cowbirds. They have this really strong con-specific attraction. If you could put a couple of female cowbirds in here. The males, they want to get in there with that female, so they come along the top, they sort of drop down, they have a slot in the middle here, they drop into the trap, and then when they fly up, they can't find their way back out. So these actually work really well. We did an experiment where we removed cowbirds and then looked at what are the effects on some of these hoses. We targeted these areas that are sort of had heavy shrub cover.
But most of the birds, well, I guess it's because the females don't get trapped. I think most of the birds in the traps were male.
Yeah, and certainly that's how it went.
It's not them though that's laying the eggs.
Males are more travel, but maybe not quite as clever as he was.
Do you all remove the eggs from the nests, the cowbird eggs?
We haven't done that experiment. At this point, we've just removed the adults. So our experiment worked. We could, so one of the reasons we were doing this is there's a lot of management programs that they call thousands and thousands of cowbirds for management of black-cap vireos in Oklahoma and Texas, for the Kirtland's warbler in Michigan. So, you know, we were trying to look at, well, what happens if you start a program like that and then discontinue it? That's one of the questions we're interested in. What are actually the effects? Most of those management programs, they don't have any control areas. So what's the comparison? What is the magnitude of the effect? And what we showed is if you do these removals, actually we can reduce the parasitism rates pretty significantly. One of the things we see is this seasonal decline in parasitism. So the early laid nests, this is the first week of our season, I guess last week or two of May, really high parasitism rates. So if they abandon to renest, one of the potential advantages is they're going to have a lower parasitism rate later in the season. So we had this result. So we look at dick sissel productivity, cowbird productivity. We can compare the control and removal sites. But the vireos in the removal sites, they produce more host chicks. That's great. I mean, if you're working with the species of conservation concern, that's the result you want. With the dick sissels, that actually didn't have much effect, at least on this species, because they can raise mixed broods. And then in 1 year of the study, all the gains that we had from reducing parasitism were basically swamped out by high rates of nest predation. So these snakes, they don't care whether it's a mix of cowbird eggs. They're happy to eat those as well. One of the surprising results, though, that we we got from this work was, in our cowbird removal experiments, there's actually higher productivity of cowbirds per nest. So it's really counterintuitive. You're removing cowbirds, and yet those vireo nests are producing more cowbirds per capita. This is a very undesirable result when you're doing this. And what it came back to was the behavioral decision that the vireos were using for deserting. And what was surprising was, if you add more cowbird eggs, that's not the cue for desertion. What they're using to desert the nest is how many of the host eggs remain. So we have this cool pattern, so the probability of desertion increases as fewer and fewer host eggs are left in the nest. All these bars on the bottom, these green acceptance, if they accepted it, then that led to nest failure. So it's kind of counterintuitive. Like the cowbird eggs look different than the host eggs in the vireos and in the dickcissels, but that's not what they're using there for this behavioral decision to desert and to start a new nest. This has some implications for conservation activities. So where we are in our current work, I was thinking about, so we have an understanding of some of the impacts of these cowbirds, but what can we do in this area that would potentially benefit grasslands? So we can do these experiments at Konza, but we're surrounded by all these private lands that are managed pretty intensively for cattle production. What rangeland management can we put out there that would potentially benefit some of these sensitive species? So, as you probably know, on a portion of Konza, we started doing the patchwork grazing. So the idea here is, instead of burning the whole area, subdividing it into thirds, burning it on a rotational basis, still stocking with the same density of cattle, but then the cattle are going to prefer these burned areas. The quality of forage is better. To get concentrated activity here, and maybe if we can rest a portion of the pasture for 2 years, that's going to create habitat conditions for some of these sensitive species. We can also compare that to ungrazed sites, so no grazing that's annually burned. And one of the wonderful things about Konza is we have all these treatments. So we have the grazing treatments here in the cow units. We have the ungrazed annually burned here in 1D. And we haven't expanded up here, but of course we have another set of replicants in these Shane Creek watersheds as well. We can get there. We're talking about expanding our sampling there. So we looked at plants, we looked at small mammals, we've also looked at grass birds. So here's the impact of the vegetative structure. So one of the nice things about the patchwork grazing is it really creates a lot of heterogeneity. If we compare it to annually burned and grazed, or annually burned and ungrazed, we get actually a more increase in the range of vegetation. So the year of burn and the patchwork grazing gets hit really hard, particularly this last year in the drought conditions. And if it's rested, actually it has a little bit better cover even than the ungrazed site. So we're increasing the heterogeneity of the landscape. And we can look at then the effects on these different bird species. So some of this mirrors the results we saw from the long-term bird transects. Our generalists like cowbirds, dickcissels, meadowlarks, you can find them in all these areas. Well, again, some reduction in these in the year of burn. And up on sandpeppers, they like the year of burn. And then the only place we really find the henslows is if we rest those patchwork grazing habitats for 1 to 2 years. So it's pretty cool. This has only been running for like 3-4 years, but those henslow sparrows are able to find that habitat and they settle in it. And then we get a few birds late season in the year of burn if it's ungrazed, but usually they're waiting till late season until the plants are a little bit taller. So we've done nest searching in these areas too. And the story here is similar to what I showed you earlier. Really high rates of parasitism across the board. It doesn't seem to be different among these different treatments. It's almost always greater than 80 to 50%. And then we look at the multiple nest parasitism. An unparasitized nest for Dixis should have about 4 eggs. Typically they have about 2, so they're losing about 2 eggs to the cowbird. And then the average number of cowbird eggs is usually somewhere between 2 to 4. So really high parasitism, and it really doesn't seem to be affected by these different treatments. This is our first 2 years of data. And the nest survival rates are also overall pretty low. And then kind of surprisingly, the best nest survival for Dixis is actually in this Ewer burn and the pasture grazing, although that's not significantly different from those other rates. So it looks like the biggest effects of pasture grazing is going to be effects on abundance and species richness, and then the rates of parasitism and nest survival are pretty similar across the board here. So, emerging results then, just for this experiment, we've got more heterogeneity. It seems to be benefiting the grass and bird community by increasing species richness. And some of it comes back to this conclusion I showed you at the start of my presentation, that these different species have different habitat requirements. So if we can increase heterogeneity, we're basically providing opportunities for a much broader range of species. So with that, it's hopefully an introduction to some of the main grassland species, a little bit of the ecology, maybe some talking points that we could work into your presentations when you're working with school kids and doing environmental education programs. And we'll be carrying on this work in the next couple of years. New PhD students that are getting interested in doing some target fish netting and color banding of some of these birds. So we're also hoping to move towards not only looking at the nest survival, but also looking at the adult survival and juvenile survival of some of these species. Thanks.
Part of our cowboy problem is that we have a very large number of bison in a very small area, and we don't send them out to western Kansas every year.
So it's interesting. So there's been other similar studies like this in grass and birds through the Flint Hills. And there's a pretty strong climb. So if you go into the southern Flint Hills, the rates of nest parasitism are much lower. So to my eye at least, the grazing management is very similar in the southern Flint Hills. And I'm not quite sure why it would be consistently that much higher here. But certainly the land management we have with the bison and the cattle, I mean, it's good habitat for the cowbirds. You can often see flocks underneath the feet of the bison. They basically use them as a beater effect. So as the bison are walking, there's insects flushing, and the cowbirds are there.